Hi, welcome to the King's Vault. I've been asking myself all day, like, if this was a brewery, what are they keeping in the vault? Is it money? Is it alcohol? Right now it's like nerdy open source shit, but like, what did they keep in the vault that people value more? So I am here to talk about the state of open source funding. You know that. I'm Kara. I work at GitHub on the developer relations team, and I work specifically with open source maintainers. So a lot of that is advocating for them internally, advocating for them externally. As part of this last year, I also ran the inaugural cohort of GitHub's Accelerator. So I'll talk a little bit about that further on. So I talk to a lot of maintainers, and money comes up the way that it tends to, which is why it's something on my mind, which is why I'm here talking about it. I'm going to talk about a couple different ways that money flows through the open source ecosystem. Now, the majority of things that open source maintainers need is not cash. Right? And your brain is going to tell you that this whole time, be like, well, what about all this other stuff? I've only got 30 minutes. Well, actually, I've only got 25 minutes. So we're only going to talk about cash today. There's a lot of monetary value in open source. People don't really agree on the numbers, but we can see here the European Commission study on the impact of open source on the European economy, since we're in Europe right now, 2021. Companies in the EU invested around 1 billion euros in open source software in 2018, which brought a positive impact on the European economy of 68 to 95 billion. We predict an increase of just 10% in contributions to open source software code would annually generate an additional 0.4 to 0.6% GDP, as well as more than 600 additional startups in the EU. So we know there's money related to open source, right? So this is kind of the system that we're going to talk through, and I will pause for a second if anyone wants to take a picture, because I didn't at FOSDEM, and there were a lot of very sad faces. But I'll come back to it. This is the general kind of process we're going to talk through. So why do we actually care about funding open source software maintenance? 90% of companies use open source, which is super cool, love it. Makes me very happy. FOSS constitutes 70 to 90% of any given piece of modern software solutions. That rules. Love it. 89% of code bases contain open source more than 4 years out of date. That makes me a little uncomfortable, actually. 84% of code bases contained at least one known open source vulnerability. It's not super cool or fun. So there's a lot of reasons to fund open source. Many of them. It is the backbone, the bedrock of the majority of our modern lives. And also, we don't want it to come crumbling down around us. So what do we know about maintainers and money? The majority of things we know about maintainers come from Tidelift's maintainer survey that they do every year. So 60% of maintainers are unpaid hobbyists. And of that 60%, 77% of them would actually like to be paid. 44% of them are solo maintainers. So if they win the lottery and move to a nice remote island, there's no one else to pick it back up. 58% have at least considered quitting a project. Who hasn't? And 22% have actually quit. Now, there's nothing wrong with stopping maintaining a project or even stopping a project. You're not like chained to it for life. But when we have all these situations where there's only one maintainer and where there are things that a whole supply chain demands on, like, we get into some issues. Fortunately, we know some of the things that will help. 56% said earning more money for maintenance work would keep them from quitting. Okay. Let's see where the money passes through. So first off, let's look at funding platforms. There's a lot of funding platforms out there, and one of the really nice things is with the rise of more and more of these, we've had folks settle into different specialties and take different approaches. So for example, Thanks.dev and Stackade are doing great dependency funding work. We see one-time crowdfunding, ongoing crowdfunding. A lot of software developers use Patreon, tipping, focus on recurring income, a whole bunch of different stuff, which is fantastic. I will talk very specifically about two platforms that are very focused on the software industry. So GitHub sponsors. which is embedded in the GitHub platform and allows people to easily sponsor folks whose work they're using, whose work they're following. An open source collective, which is a fiscal host on Open Collective, which does a lot of work bringing in money and helping projects distribute it to folks in their ecosystem. There's a lot more approaches and funding models, right? You've got Tidelift, which has got a subscription model. You've got Open Teams, which has got a service marketplace. You've got Gitcoin, which is trying out quadratic funding. We don't have time to cover all of this, but suffice it to say, there's a lot going on. So a couple numbers, I promised you numbers. So GitHub Sponsors has passed through $40 million since 2019. Open Source Collective, this is actually not a copy-paste error. When I did the math, I thought it was a mistake, but also have done $40 million since 2019. So we've got a good consistency here. And for the Open Source Collective, that's $10 million in 2023. So funding platforms are effectively lowering the barrier for sponsorship. We're seeing increased usage. It's working. If you give people easy ways to pass through money, they're going to take advantage of it. So that's good. But who's actually using these? Let's look at FOSS contributor funds. A FOSS contributor fund, the definition when this kind of arose from Indeed said, FOSS contributor fund is a framework for selecting open source projects that a company supports financially. This initiative is designed to encourage open source participation and help companies take an active role in sustaining the projects they depend on. So more colloquially, when we say FOSS fund, we usually mean any instance of a company funding open source projects, usually their dependencies, in like at least a semi-organized way without expecting something really concrete in return. So I've highlighted in yellow here how this kind of works. You have companies passing money via their FOSS fund to a funding platform who then pass that money along to the projects and the maintainers. Companies have been giving money to open source for a long time, certainly since before 2019, but the rise of the concept of the FOSS fund as an organized program, you can really trace back to Indeed open sourcing their model for it in 2019. And a lot of companies followed suit. They came out and they publicly said, we're supporting open source, we're putting money on the table, and we're organizing how to do it in a way where our employees can vote on it, they can feel like they have a voice in how we support open source, which is very cool. GitHub Sponsors found the average value of an org sponsorship versus an individual was 15 times, which is very realistic to my salary versus how much money a company has. They've got a lot more. So how much money is actually coming through this? In 2023, back of the napkin math, I think about $12 million went through FOSS funds, which is actually not a lot. I mean, it would be a lot for any of us if we were to come across $12 million. But when you look at the value of the open source ecosystem, this is actually kind of, is this like an awkwardly small number? We have companies that gave a fair amount, companies like Sentry, doing, $500K. I've got a couple examples down here in the corner. But, overall, it's not a huge amount. So what's actually going on here? First of all, I would say FOSS funds are really benefiting maintainers. Like the money that's coming through is making a difference in people's lives. It's making a difference to projects. It's meaningful. But it is not proving to be a sustainable single model for the ecosystem. $12 million is not going to hold up open source. They're also not really contributing to stable or predictable funding. The majority of FOSS funds give one-time amounts, often which employees vote on, so a very good mechanism for getting employees engaged in open source, but you can't plan your project's budget on hoping you get a FOSS fund bundle of cash. So not really stable funding. We've also found that expecting companies to fund open source based on positive press is a failed path. I think we thought, optimistically, that if everyone came out and said they were doing this, everyone else would also come out and say they were doing this. A lot of companies that I looked at who are giving to open source don't want to be open about it. There's a number of reasons for that. I think one of them is that the amount of money that you might scrape together internally to sponsor a project looks incredible when you pry it from your VP's hands, but from the outside it looks paltry, because the company's worth a huge amount of money. So you have instances where people really, they're doing their best, but the company doesn't want to be super public about it. I would also say that FOSS funds are particularly vulnerable to real or imaginary macroeconomic conditions. So we really saw this in 2023. It was the test of this. FOSS funds did drop significantly. So they're vulnerable. They're not a focus for OSPOs. OSPOs are incredible open source programs offices, are doing essential work getting people out contributing to open source. And working on an inner source and everything like that. But they have very limited budgets. So it makes sense that most OSPOs are not focused on getting money outside from the company out into the ecosystem. They're trying to get resources out there, other kinds of resources that they're more able to access. I think the last thing I want to say is that the companies that went out and did publicly talk about the structures of how they were doing funding did make a difference and continue to make a difference. So keep doing that, keep talking about how you're funding open source, because we saw many, many companies when they came out said we were inspired by XYZ. So that is actually having an impact. In terms of strengthening this model, we need better data for identifying dependencies, so we're not relying on charisma to choose who gets funded, which is what studies are still kind of finding. We need better data on how funding a project actually impacts them. We need a lot more awareness, more companies committing publicly to this model. If that's something that your company can do, check out fossfunders.com. They're gathering a list of people who are giving to open source. You don't have to say how much. And then there's a lot of platforms working on better tooling. We talked about companies. Let's talk about individuals. Let's talk about when a person gives money to open source. And here we go. So individuals tend to either pass direct cash through or go through a funding platform. 60% of GitHub sponsors funding in 2022 was from individuals. You're crushing it. If you're giving money directly to open source projects or maintainers, nice work. Thank you. You are actually really having an impact. Individuals are outperforming company FOSS funds, which is very embarrassing for companies, but also nice work for you specifically. So we cannot rely on individual sponsorships to prop up the ecosystem. That ain't gonna work. But it's keeping us going right now. So we also found, interestingly, that ongoing sponsorships from individuals are more resilient to economic downturn. So when companies pulled their budget, individuals did not, which is wild because my groceries are 25% more expensive, which means I know yours are too. But people kept giving to the projects they depended on. So, damn. Let's talk about foundations. Hey, money's going through to foundations, right? Most common method of funding an open source project, joining or starting a foundation. Here we see company money going through to foundations. And we see also the direct method we'll talk about of company employment. So here's a much bigger number, 304 million USD across 32 software foundations in 2022. I took out Wikimedia Foundation, who are very cool, but they're not in this chart. So $304 million. That's a bigger number, still not as big as I really would like to see, but 58% of that went through the Linux Foundation. So, and I think that number is actually going to be higher in 2023, because you see the Linux Foundation income here really rose significantly from 177 million in 2022 to 262 million in 2023. Badass, nice work. So when we look at the structure of foundations, I'm going to speak sort of to the Linux Foundation structure, since so much of the funding is going through there. But as many of you know, it is a diverse foundation of foundations, a trade guild with many versions of things underneath it. So what do foundations do to support projects? A ton! Legal and financial services, help with project governance, hosting services, marketing, advocacy, security audits. We ask open source maintainers to wear like a dozen hats. It's a constant problem where we're like, oh, you like making a project? You want to code a project? Can you also do a lot of accounting? Do you want to do a lot of community management? Foundations take like 12 of those hats off the top and allow folks to focus on like the last 3 or 4. So fantastic. Foundations, however, are not focused on paying money for project maintenance. They're not focused on paying maintainers directly. That's not what the model is about. It is very rare that someone is employed full-time by a foundation to maintain a project, with some notable exceptions. So who is maintaining these big projects? The professional maintainer. LF research found among critical open source projects, the majority of maintainers and core contributors enjoy full-time employment. I also enjoy full-time employment. This is that 13% of maintainers that are professional maintainers that we see in the TideLift survey. So these folks are, and I know folks in the room are, maintainers who are employed by a company that depends on that software, that relies on that software to maintain that software. And so we're seeing here, right, software foundations are not directly paying for project maintenance. They're removing overhead and sort of things like that. Instead, foundations have a really tight loop with these companies that depend on the projects in their portfolio, and they advocate for those companies to hire people to work on them full time. And they focus a lot on those really important corporate relationships to kind of keep that cycle going. They also make donating to open source easy for companies. It is very hard. Like the administrative bulk of trying to go through and sponsor a bunch of projects is tough. And there's platforms trying to make it easier, but it's still tough. It is easy to give a nice large check to a foundation. They have people who are employed to make it nice and easy for you, and you have like one clear benefit, and you can pass that along to your executives. So foundations have done a good job solving for the way that companies give money. I think that this raises really interesting questions, right? What would it look like if we had more maintainers who were employed full-time through a foundation? Would that, kind of change who gets into software maintenance, who stays in software maintenance full-time, for folks who don't want to work for like a large corporation? What could that look like? I think it also asks, like, if we know so much of this money is successfully going through this model, are there ways to help benefit the many independent projects that are having a harder time accessing resources and money and stuff like that? So a lot to think about. But I'm not here for answers. I'm here to keep going. So grant and government funding. What's a grant? You say you're going to do something. They say, I'm going to give you money if you do that. You go and do it. There's two main ways that grants happen. Philanthropic orgs, so like a person got really rich and then put a bunch of their money in a pot and they give it out, or governmental initiatives. So one of the governmental initiatives you may have heard of is coming out of the German government. This is Sovereign Tech Fund. I think Sovereign Tech Fund is incredible. If you haven't heard of them, please look up what they're doing because it's real good stuff. So they are focusing on critical software dependencies. They're not just funding projects from Germany. They're looking all over the world and saying, what do we depend on? And how do we fund basic, boring-ass maintenance on those projects? How do we fund the unglamorous essential stuff? They've identified in their first report 195 critical technologies that they really want to help take care of, and they've supported 40 of those in the past year with over 15 million euros. So very, very cool stuff. In terms of grant funding, we are seeing governments start to get more involved. We're at the start of that. European Commission's development of a funding mechanism for sustaining open source software. They say there's a clear need for a European funding mechanism to help sustain critical open source software communities. And this has been a big topic all week across the many, many, many forums that have been happening. But I would be remiss to not talk about the main form of grant funding that we see right now, which is scientific and academic. If you talk to people in the scientific software space about grants, they're like, yeah, I eat grants for breakfast, whatever. If you talk to anyone else, they're like, what the hell is a grant? They give those for software? Like, the rest of us don't really know what that is. So there is really a limited understanding of grant funding opportunities outside the academic and scientific software space. Agencies, speaking, especially as a US person, like NSF and NASA, are looking to advance software with an academic or research relationship, but they want something fresh to happen. So even for scientific software, there isn't maintenance money going through. And similarly, philanthropies, we see more Sloan, CZI really prefer new things to maintenance. So we're still not seeing maintenance money. Let's talk about venture funding. Venture funding is when someone has too much money and they want to give you some money, but then they own you. It's a technical definition. So venture funding money, we see venture money come through. It goes through a related business that then, is giving money and resources to the project or the maintainer. I had to have someone tell me this morning, apparently much more common in the US than the UK. What a surprise, our bastion of capitalism. But things are changing, and you too can get VC money. So investments in costs like open core businesses is increasing. Here we've got OSS Capital's cost VC funding report. The cost category has grown dramatically over the last decade, from 10 billion USD to 500 billion today. Even so, we are still in the early stages of costs, which we believe will grow into a $3 trillion category by 2030. So the VCs are hungry. Increasingly, they're realizing that there's money in open source. And of course, for founders who want to work with them, people really need to find the VCs that understand open source and are able to work with it reliably. We need more materials that help maintainers understand what kind of funding is right for them and if venture funding is right for them. We need to set maintainers up for success, so when someone knocks on the door and they're like, do you want like a bunch of money? They know like if it's a good fit for them, if that's a growth curve that they actually want to pursue, or if it's, if it's going to not really be a great fit. So a lot of conversations I think we need to set people up for success. As part of that, we did the GitHub Accelerator this past year. It's experimental. It's our first time doing it. What we did was in 2022, we gave $500,000 to open source. We sponsored our dependencies as a FOSS fund. In 2023, we said, that was cool, but what if we could do more? Like, we're just throwing money at projects. Can we support them better? So we took that money and we put it through our accelerator. We gave folks, we took 20 open source projects. We gave $20,000 funding per project across a 10-week program. And we brought in people who were successfully sustaining their projects and themselves and said, what are you doing? Can you talk to these folks? Can you pass that along? A lot of things there, but I will say a couple. First of all, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to open source funding. There's just not. There's not going to be. That's good. That's healthy. But like, it makes this much more complicated, right? We have to talk about a lot of different models, most of which I can't talk about today because I got like 2 minutes left. Maintainers need better education on funding paths and the ups and downs. Like, we need more than a chart here or there. We need to really have these conversations. And we need accelerators like GitHub Accelerator that does not require all projects to be startups. The majority of the projects in our program were not looking to take like VC funding. It was a mix across what folks were looking for. In terms of barriers that independent FOSS maintainers face, you've seen a lot of these themes before, and I don't have time to really dally on them too much. But I would say mentorship around sustainability, like actually hearing from what folks are doing in the field, is really important. Legal guidance and financial advice for folks outside the foundation ecosystem is really lacking. In terms of experiments and funding, there's a lot to experiment with. I can only talk about one thing with my time today. So I'm going to mention Simon Willison, Dataset, co-founder of Django, who was in GitHub's Accelerator. And something that he's really been trying to work on is, what does it look like to pay maintainers to speak to your team? So it's tough to get money to send outside the company for open source, but we all have seen underutilized company training budgets, consulting budgets. What does it look to take that and say, we're going to pay this open source maintainer for a tool we rely on to talk to the team? The internal team gets to speak to the expert, and for the maintainer, it's a time-boxed commitment. It's not something they're tied to long-term. So I think that's a really interesting example. I would also say look at Filippo Valsorda's experiment with retainer agreements for full-time maintainers, which I think is interesting. And he's a year into that, and then talked to him day before yesterday, and it's actually going really well. Hell yeah. So let's put it together. Okay, here's our chart. Money's going through, or not going through, really, as the case may be. We haven't seen that much money throughout this talk. So what's next? We need more data in order to see what works and what does not work. So can your org do a survey? Can you release trends that you see in your internal data? Is there stuff that you can do there? We need more companies publicly committing to funding. Can your company do this? Can you join FOSS funders? Maintainers need more resources and mentorship to decide how to sustain their projects. I don't want to click keyboard setup. Okay, there we go. To understand the upsides and downsides of each approach. So like, if you're someone who has tried out a model, what does that look like, and what have you learned? Can you share that? I think we should do what we can to advocate for government funding through bodies like OpenUK and raise awareness of successful taxpayer-funded programs like Sovereign Tech Fund. What does it look like to have more taxpayer-funded programs? I would say also that 2023 was a reminder that corporate budgets and priorities are fickle, and any funding plan needs to take this into consideration. How do we make it harder to cut open source funding and make it stable? So that's what's up. Thank you to many kind and wise people. Send me an email. Let me know your thoughts.